For years, you've probably heard one piece of health advice more than any other: just eat less processed food. It sounds simple, it sounds wise, and honestly, it might be the most misleading health advice you've been following. Welcome to Longevity Lab. I'm Claire.
And I'm Robert. And Claire, I have to confess, I thought I had this one figured out. Processed food, bad, whole food, good. End of story. But reading the notes for this episode, I realized I've been walking around with a definition in my head that just doesn't match the science.
And you're not alone. In fact, that's why we're doing this episode. Because the term processed food has become so vague, it's basically useless. And worse, it's actually making people avoid perfectly healthy foods while giving them a false sense of safety about things that are actively damaging their health.
Wait, so you're telling me that some of the things I've been avoiding because I thought they were too processed might actually be fine? And some of the things I thought were healthy might be the problem?
Exactly. And that's where the real science comes in. So let's start with a question. When I say processed food, what comes to your mind?
Okay, first thing, packaged snacks, chips, cookies, crackers, things with a long ingredient list full of words I can't pronounce, frozen dinners, soda, that sort of thing.
And what about a bag of baby carrots that's been washed and bagged, or a can of chickpeas, or a carton of milk that's been pasteurized and homogenized?
Well, those are different. Those are just prepared, right? They're not really processed.
And here's where the myth starts to crack. Because by the strictest definition, all of those things are processed. And actually, that's a good thing. Pasteurization made milk safe to drink. Canning chickpeas makes them accessible for people who don't have 6 hours to soak and cook dried beans. The problem isn't processing. The problem is a very specific type of processing, and the wellness industry has done a terrible job of helping people tell the difference.
So I've been feeling guilty about buying canned beans for nothing?
Probably. And thousands of other people have too. So let's reset. And the best way to do that is with something called the NOVA food classification system. This was developed by researchers at the University of São Paulo in Brazil, and it divides all foods into 4 groups based on the extent and purpose of processing, not just whether it's been processed at all.
Okay, I'm listening. 4 groups. What are they?
Group 1 is unprocessed or minimally processed foods. This is basically the whole foods you're thinking of: fresh fruits, vegetables, meat, fish, eggs, milk, but it also includes things that have been minimally altered to make them usable, like frozen vegetables, dried herbs, or meat that's been cut and packaged.
Right. So the stuff my grandmother would recognize.
Exactly. Group 2 is processed culinary ingredients. These are things like oils, butter, sugar, salt, honey. They're extracted from natural sources and used to cook with. They're not meant to be eaten alone. They're ingredients.
So olive oil, sea salt, that kind of thing.
Yes. And here's where it gets interesting. Group 3 is processed foods. These are made by adding salt, oil, sugar, or other Group 2 ingredients to Group 1 foods. Think canned vegetables in brine, salted nuts, artisanal cheese, smoked fish, freshly baked bread from a bakery. These foods are processed, but the processing is primarily to preserve them or make them more palatable. They still mostly resemble the original food.
So a can of tomatoes with a little salt is group 3. That's fine, right?
It's perfectly fine. In many cases, it's actually nutritionally superior to fresh tomatoes that have been shipped across the world and stored for weeks. Canned tomatoes are picked at peak ripeness and processed within hours, so their nutrient profile is often better. But here's the group that changes everything. Group 4. Ultra-processed foods.
Ah, this is where the trouble starts.
Ultra-processed foods are industrially manufactured formulations. And the key thing is, they contain ingredients you would never find in a home kitchen. Things like hydrogenated oils, high fructose corn syrup, protein isolates, modified starches, emulsifiers, stabilizers, artificial flavors, colors, non-caloric sweeteners. These formulations are designed to be hyper-palatable. They're engineered to make you want to eat more than you intend to.
So we're talking about things like soda, packaged cookies, frozen pizza, chicken nuggets from fast food chains.
Yes, but here's where the science gets really specific. A 2022 study published in the BMJ followed more than 100,000 adults over a 20-year period. And after controlling for every possible confounding factor, income, education, body mass index, exercise habits, smoking, total calories consumed, they found that people whose diets contained more than 20% ultra-processed food by weight had a significantly higher risk of developing chronic diseases. We're talking cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, certain cancers. And here's the number that stopped me. Each 10% increase in ultra-processed food consumption was associated with a 12% higher risk of cancer overall.
12%? Just for a 10% increase?
Just for a 10% increase. And these are studies that controlled for everything. They're not just measuring the fact that people who eat more ultra-processed foods also tend to smoke more and exercise less. The data is adjusted for all of that. The ultra-processed food itself is having a measurable independent effect on health outcomes.
I had no idea the effect was that quantifiable. I thought it was just common sense. Processed food, bad for you, but you're saying there's actually a dose-response relationship.
Exactly. And that's the science that changes everything because it tells us something very specific. It's not about avoiding junk food. It's about recognizing that ultra-processed foods operate through specific biological mechanisms that whole foods don't, and those mechanisms are now well understood.
Okay, this is where I need you to unpack that. What is actually happening inside my body when I eat ultra-processed foods that's different from eating the same number of calories from whole foods?
So, we're talking about multiple mechanisms here. Let me walk through the ones that the best evidence supports. First, nutrient displacement. Ultra-processed foods are engineered to be shelf-stable and flavorful, not nutritious. So when they make up a significant portion of your diet, they push out nutrient-dense foods. You're getting calories without the fiber, antioxidants, polyphenols, vitamins, and minerals that your body needs for metabolic health.
Right. So you're full from the calories, but nutritionally starving.
Exactly. And that's mechanism 1. Mechanism 2, glycemic load and insulin response. Many ultra-processed foods are made from refined carbohydrates and added sugars that spike blood glucose rapidly. Over time, this pattern drives insulin resistance, which is the root of metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, and accelerated biological aging. Each spike triggers an inflammatory cascade.
So it's not just the sugar content, it's the rate at which it hits your system.
Precisely. And mechanism 3 is the one that surprised me most when I first encountered the research. The physical structure of ultra-processed food changes how your body processes it. A 2020 study at the University of Cambridge looked at this phenomenon directly. They gave participants 2 meals that were matched for total calories, macronutrients, same protein, same fat, same carbohydrate, and even the same ingredients. The only difference was one meal was whole foods that participants prepared and chewed normally. The other was the same ingredients blended into a smooth liquid.
Interesting. So the nutritional content was identical, but the physical form was different.
And here's what they found. When participants consumed the liquid form, they absorbed those calories more rapidly. Their blood sugar spiked higher, and perhaps most importantly, they consumed more total calories at their next meal. The physical structure of food, Whether it requires chewing, how quickly it empties from your stomach, how fast it enters your small intestine, all of that affects your metabolic response. And ultra-processed foods are the liquid meal in solid form. They're engineered to break down quickly, to be absorbed rapidly, and to bypass your body's natural satiety signals.
So my body doesn't even realize it's eating.
In a sense, yes. And that brings us to mechanism 4, the gut microbiome. Your gut bacteria thrive on fiber. That's their primary food source. When you eat whole plant foods, the fiber travels to your colon, where your gut microbiome ferments it into short-chain fatty acids. Those fatty acids are anti-inflammatory. They support immune function. They strengthen your gut barrier, and they even signal your brain to stop eating.
And ultra-processed foods don't do any of that.
They do the opposite. Because they're typically fiber depleted, they starve your gut microbiome, and they contain emulsifiers, common additives like soy lecithin, carrageenan polysorbate 80, that have been shown in animal studies and emerging human research to disrupt the mucus layer that protects your intestinal lining. That disruption can lead to increased intestinal permeability. You might have heard it called leaky gut, though that's more of a popular term than a strict medical diagnosis.
So the emulsifiers designed to make the food creamy are actually damaging my gut barrier.
That's exactly what the research suggests. A 2015 study published in Nature showed that two common emulsifiers, carboxymethylcellulose and polysorbate 80, altered the gut microbiome composition in mice and promoted low-grade intestinal inflammation. And more recent human studies are beginning to confirm similar effects. Not for every person and not every emulsifier, but the pattern is concerning enough that researchers are actively studying it.
I will never look at a creamy label the same way again.
And look, I'm not saying that a single food with emulsifiers is going to wreck your gut, but this is the cumulative effect we're talking about. When these foods make up 50, 60, 70% of your daily calories, which they do for a significant portion of the population in Western countries, the mechanisms add up. Nutrient displacement, glycemic volatility, disrupted satiety signaling, gut microbiome damage, chronic low-grade inflammation. All of that accelerates biological aging.
Okay, I need to sit with this for a second, because my understanding up until this episode was basically processed food bad, eat whole foods, everything in moderation. But what you're telling me is that the science has moved way beyond that. It's not about the concept of processing, it's about a specific category of food that's been engineered to be hyper-palatable, fiber depleted, and physically structured to bypass my body's natural regulation systems.
You've nailed it. That's exactly right.
So let me ask the question that's on my mind, and probably on every listener's mind right now. What do I actually do with this information? Because I can't realistically eliminate every ultra-processed food from my diet.
And you shouldn't need to. The research tells us something interesting here. It's not about perfection, it's about proportion. The 2022 BMJ study I mentioned earlier found that the biggest benefits came from reducing ultra-processed food intake from high levels, say 50% of daily calories, down to about 20% below 20%. The risk continued to decrease, but at a slower rate. So the most powerful change is moving from a diet that's dominated by ultra-processed foods to one where they're a minority.
So the target is keep ultra-processed food under 20% of my total calorie intake.
That's a reasonable research-supported goal. And here's how you get there without going crazy. Use what I call the 3-question test. Before you eat anything, ask yourself these 3 questions. Question 1. Could I make this in my own kitchen with ingredients I can buy at a regular grocery store?
Okay, I like that. So for a bowl of oatmeal with berries and nuts, yes, I could absolutely make that. A packaged protein bar with 20 ingredients and chemicals I don't recognize, probably not.
Exactly. Question 2. Does this food still look like the thing it came from?
So a chicken breast still looks like a chicken breast. A chicken nugget shaped into a star doesn't.
Right again. And question 3. How many ingredients does this food have, and can I name them?
This is the ingredient list test. If the ingredient list is longer than my arm and half the words sound like chemistry experiments, it's probably ultra processed.
And specifically, if the ingredient list contains something you would not find in a home kitchen, that's your red flag. Things like soy protein isolate, maltodextrin, sodium benzoate, carrageenan, artificial sweeteners, high fructose corn syrup. Not that these are inherently toxic in small amounts, but their presence signals that you're looking at a group 4 food.
Okay, I'm going to use that test. But I have one more concern. I've seen a lot of health advice online saying you should just avoid anything with more than 5 ingredients, or avoid anything in a package, or avoid anything with a label. That's been floating around for years. What does the science say about that?
I'm glad you raised that because that kind of advice is exactly what I want to push back on. A can of diced tomatoes might have 4 ingredients: tomatoes, tomato juice, salt, and citric acid. That's a group 3 processed food. It's perfectly nutritious. Meanwhile, a highly processed vegan protein bar could have 20 ingredients, including pea protein isolate, chicory root fiber, cocoa butter, natural flavors, and stevia extract. It's ultra processed, but it's in a package with a green label and plant based written on it. Which one looks healthier based on the 5 ingredient rule?
The can of tomatoes looks worse.
And that's the trap. The wellness industry has sold us on the idea that natural equals good and processed equals bad. But a frozen bag of broccoli that was flash frozen within hours of being picked is nutritionally superior to a fresh broccoli that's been sitting in a truck for 2 weeks. The processing preserved its nutrients. And a homemade soup made from whole ingredients that you cook and then freeze in portions, that's been processed by you for your convenience. It's group 3 at worst.
So the frame matters. It's not about avoiding anything that's been altered from its original form. It's about recognizing when the alteration has crossed a line into industrial formulation.
That's the most accurate way to think about it. And I want to give you one more piece of evidence that really solidifies this. There's a 2021 study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition that directly compared 2 diets matched for total calories, macronutrients, sugar, sodium, and fiber. The only difference was one diet was composed primarily of ultra-processed foods and the other of unprocessed foods. Participants could eat as much or as little as they wanted from each diet.
So the only variable was whether the food was ultra processed or not. Everything else was controlled.
Exactly. And here's what happened. When participants were on the ultra-processed diet, they consumed an average of 500 more calories per day compared to the unprocessed diet. 500 calories. And they gained weight and body fat. When they switched to the unprocessed diet, they spontaneously ate fewer calories and lost weight, even though the meals were matched for all the factors we normally blame for overeating.
500 extra calories a day. That's a full meal just because the food was ultra processed.
Just because of the physical form and formulation. The researchers hypothesized that the differences in eating rate, the textural properties, and the energy density of the foods drove the effect. The ultra-processed foods were softer, easier to chew, and absorbed faster, so participants ate them more quickly and took in more calories before their satiety signals kicked in.
This is going to change how I think about every meal. I'm genuinely rethinking my breakfast.
Tell me about your current breakfast.
My current breakfast is a bowl of whole grain cereal with milk. I thought that was a good choice. It's fortified with vitamins. It's low in sugar compared to some options. But now I'm looking at the ingredient list and realizing it's made from refined grains with a list of additives that goes on and on.
Let me give you an alternative that's actually easier. Overnight oats. 3 ingredients: rolled oats, milk or yogurt, and some berries. You can prepare it in 5 minutes the night before. It's a group 1 meal with group 2 ingredients added for flavor. It takes the same amount of effort as pouring cereal, and you've completely avoided ultra processed food for that meal.
And it's cheaper too. Oats are incredibly inexpensive.
Exactly. And that's the thing I want listeners to really hear. Ultra processed food is not cheaper, it's more expensive per unit of nutrition. A study from 2020 analyzed the cost of different food categories and found that ultra processed foods cost more per serving than minimally processed foods when you account for nutritional density. The idea that healthy eating is expensive is actually a myth perpetuated by the food industry. A bag of lentils costs less than a frozen pizza and yields multiple meals.
That's an important point because I think a lot of people, including me, have told themselves I can't afford to eat healthy. And the food industry has absolutely capitalized on that belief.
They have. And that's why the science is so empowering. Because once you understand the NOVA classification and the 3-question test, you're not just following arbitrary rules, you're making informed decisions based on how food actually interacts with your biology. Let me give you one more practical tool. When you're grocery shopping, try to spend most of your time on the perimeter of the store. That's where fresh produce, meats, dairy, and fresh bread tend to be. The interior aisles contain the majority of ultra-processed foods.
Shop the perimeter. That's simple enough to remember.
And one more thing. When you do buy packaged foods from the interior aisles, focus on the ones with the shortest ingredient lists and the ingredients you recognize. Canned beans, canned tomatoes, frozen vegetables, whole grains like oats and quinoa, nuts, seeds. These are minimally processed. They're Group 1 and Group 3 foods that support health. A can of black beans with a little salt is not the same category as a bag of tortilla chips made with refined corn flour, hydrogenated oil, and artificial cheese flavoring.
It seems obvious when you put it that way, and yet the health advice I've been hearing for years never made that distinction. It was just eat whole foods, and that's so vague it's practically useless.
That's exactly the problem, and it's why we're doing this episode. There's actually a fascinating case study from the Blue Zone regions that illustrates this point perfectly.
The blue zones, places like Okinawa, Japan, Bro Sardinia, Italy, Ro Ikaria, Greece.
Yes, if you look at the traditional diets in these longevity hotspots, they all share a common feature. Ultra-processed foods are virtually absent. Not because they're avoiding processing as a concept, but because the foods available in these regions are whole foods prepared using traditional methods. In Sardinia, the diet is based on whole grains, legumes, garden vegetables, and sheep's milk cheese. In Okinawa, it's sweet potatoes, soy, seaweed, and bitter melon. These foods are processed in the Group 2 and Group 3 sense. They're cooked, fermented, preserved. But they are not industrially formulated.
So the centenarians in these regions are not eating a whole foods diet by some strict definition. They're eating traditionally prepared food that happens to fall into groups 1, 2, and 3 on the NOVA classification.
Exactly. And this is why I find the NOVA system so useful. It cuts through the confusion. It's not about being a purist, it's about understanding that Group 4 foods, ultra-processed foods, are biologically different from everything else. And the best available evidence, including a 2023 systematic review and meta-analysis in the BMJ, that included over 200 studies, found that higher consumption of ultra-processed foods was consistently associated with higher risk of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, anxiety, depression, and all-cause mortality.
I want to pause on that. That meta-analysis, how many studies and how many participants?
Over 200 studies representing more than 30 million participants across multiple countries and decades of follow-up.
30 million participants. That's not a small study. That's the accumulated evidence of an entire field.
It is. And the consistency is remarkable. Almost every study shows a dose-response relationship, More ultra-processed food, worse health outcomes. And this holds true even when you control for every other health behavior you can measure.
And look, I'll be honest, I followed the everything in moderation advice myself for years. I thought as long as I wasn't eating extreme amounts of junk food, I was fine. But this research shows that the cumulative effect of ultra processed foods operating through multiple biological mechanisms is something that moderation doesn't account for.
That's a really important insight. Moderation works for things where the dose is the primary issue. A glass of wine occasionally, the research is mixed, but moderate consumption likely has different effects than heavy consumption. But ultra processed foods are different. They're not just a matter of dose, they're structurally and biologically distinct from whole foods. And the mechanisms I described, nutrient displacement, glycemic volatility, disrupted satiety, gut microbiome damage, those are present even at so-called moderate consumption levels.
So the advice, everything in moderation, was designed for a food environment where most foods were in groups 1 through 3. It doesn't apply the same way to group 4.
That's exactly right. And that's why this episode matters, because the food environment has fundamentally changed in the last 50 years. Ultra processed foods now make up nearly 60% of the average American diet. For adolescents, it's closer to 70%. That's not a personal failing, that's a structural reality. And the first step to changing it is understanding what ultra processed foods actually are and how they work in your body.
So, what's the single most important thing a listener can take away from this episode if they can only remember one thing?
The 3-question test. Can I make this in my kitchen? Does it still look like the thing it came from? Can I name the ingredients? If the answer is no to any of those, pause. Think about what you're about to eat, not with guilt, not with fear, but with awareness. Because awareness is the foundation of empowered choice.
Today's rule: shop the perimeter, use the 3-question test, and remember that processing itself isn't the enemy. It's the industrial transformation of food into something your body doesn't recognize as food.
That's beautiful, Robert. And I'll add one more thing. If you have an existing health condition, diabetes, heart disease, autoimmune issues, definitely talk to your doctor about specific dietary changes. The general principles apply to everyone, but individual circumstances matter, and that's absolutely a conversation to have with your healthcare provider.
Well, Claire, I think I have a grocery list to rewrite. Thank you for this. Seriously. I feel like I've been given a map for a territory I thought I understood but didn't.
That's exactly the goal. And to everyone listening, we'd love to hear from you. What's one ultra processed food you're going to swap out this week? Share it in the comments. Let's learn from each other.
If this episode changed how you think about food, hit that subscribe button. We release new episodes every day, and we cover topics just like this one. Science-backed, no hype, just practical knowledge you can actually use. Share this with someone who still thinks a can of beans is the same as a bag of chips.
Thanks for listening to Longevity Lab. We'll see you on the next episode.
Stay healthy, stay curious.